I went to the Olympic Peninsula in September of 2014 because I had nowhere else to put myself. The divorce papers had been final for 3 weeks. The apartment I moved into felt borrowed, like I was staying inside someone else's life. Every sound bothered me. Cars passing, neighbors walking above me. The quiet I wanted was not the kind you find by turning things off. I wanted distance. I wanted weather. I wanted a place that did not care what I had lost. I chose the peninsula because rain there is not dramatic. It is steady. It does not announce itself. It just arrives and stays. I told myself that would help. I planned a short solo trip for days, maybe 5 if I felt better. I packed light and plain. Tarp shelter instead of a tent. A small fire kit. No stove. 1 trekking pole to hold the ridge line. I wanted things simple and quiet. I did not want walls. I parked at a pullout that was not marked for camping, but not restricted either. The trailhead was an old one, half swallowed by moss. The sign had faded until the words were only ghosts of letters, pale shapes pressed into gray wood. I remember noticing how wet the forest floor was even after a dry summer. The ground gave under my boots with each step, not sinking, just yielding. Ferns brushed my legs. Water dripped from every surface, even when it was not raining. The first day passed without friction. I hiked a few miles in and followed a side path that looked like it used to be maintained. It sloped down toward a creek. I stopped when I felt the air cool and smelled water before I saw it. I set my shelter in a stand of cedar and hemlock where the ground rose just enough to stay out of the flood line. The trees were old and spaced wide. The canopy filtered the light into a green dimness that felt like evening even in mid-afternoon. I strung the tarp low, one side almost touching the ground. I wanted it tight and quiet. I gathered wood and made a small fire pit with stones from the creek. The rain came and went without pattern. Sometimes it fell in a fine mist. Sometimes it drummed on leaves hard enough to drown out the water nearby. I cooked, ate, and sat until the light drained out of the forest. I felt calm for the first time in months. The forest had weight. It pressed in and held me still. The first night was ordinary. Sounds moved through the dark as they always do. Small things. Branches settling. Water shifting. I slept in stretches and woke often, but I did not feel watched. In the morning I checked the perimeter out of habit and saw nothing worth noting. Deer tracks near the creek. Old elk sign farther out. Nothing close to the shelter. The second day was colder. The rain stayed. It soaked into my clothes and stayed there. I walked without direction, following game trails and old logging scars that had softened back into the forest. The peninsula holds its history close. You do not see ruins so much as you feel places where things once were. Straight lines that do not belong. Trees growing in rows that no longer matter. I came back to camp earlier than planned because the light was thinning again. Clouds pressed low enough that the tops of the trees disappeared into white. I built another fire and dried my socks. I wrote in a notebook I had brought for no real reason. I did not write about my marriage. I wrote about the creek and the way the water folded around stones. I wrote about how the rain made the forest smell clean and old at the same time. That night, after the fire burned down, I lay on my back and listened. I was awake enough to know I was awake. I was not drifting. I heard a sound that did not fit. It was not sharp. It was not fast. It was a shift of weight, pressure into mud. Then another, a few feet away. The sound moved around me, slow and measured, like someone walking without shoes. I did not move at first. I waited for the rhythm to resolve into something familiar. It did not. The steps did not approach or retreat. They circled. The sound traveled from one side of the shelter to the other, always just beyond the edge of the tarp. The rain had eased to a fine hiss. There was no wind. I could hear the ground respond to each step, the wet earth giving and holding. I listened for breath. I listened for fabric. I listened for anything that would place a person in space. There was nothing, just the sound of weight shifting, of a body pressing into mud. The steps paused at my head, then moved on. They were not hurried. They were not careful. They were patient. I sat up and shouted into the dark. The word I used does not matter. It was loud. It came from my chest. The forest took it and flattened it. Nothing answered. The steps did not stop. They continued their slow orbit, keeping the same distance. I could not see past the edge of the tarp. My headlamp was off. I did not turn it on. I do not know why. The idea of lighting myself up inside that small space felt wrong. After a long time, the sound faded. It did not leave. It simply became part of the background. I lay back down and waited for sleep. It did not come. When morning arrived, it did not feel like relief. It felt like an interruption. I stepped out into gray light and checked the ground around the shelter. The mud was soft from the rain. My own tracks were clear where I had moved the night before. Around the shelter, pressed deep into the earth, were impressions that did not match my boots or any animal I knew well. They were long and smooth. No tread, no clear heel. The edges were rounded, like the ground had been pushed down by something broad and flat. They sank deeper than mine. The mud there was the same consistency. I pressed my boot into one of the impressions, and it did not reach the bottom. I weighed just under 200 pounds. I had been carrying maybe 30 pounds of gear. Whatever made those marks had pressed down harder than I had. I followed the impressions for a short distance until they blurred into churned earth near the trees. They did not lead to or from the creek. They did not break into a stride. They stayed slow, measured. I did not find a clear set of toes or a heel. The ground may have been too soft to hold that detail, but it still bothered me. I told myself what I needed to hear. Someone else in the forest. Barefoot for comfort. Heavy for reasons that did not matter. The peninsula draws people who want to disappear for a while. I was one of them. I ate, packed what I needed for the day, and walked to put distance between myself and the shelter. I did not see anyone. I did not hear voices. The forest stayed closed. In the afternoon, I found myself circling back toward camp without intending to. The rain picked up again. I was cold and tired. I decided to stay one more night and leave in the morning. I reset the tarp lower than before. I moved the fire pit closer so I could see the edges of the shelter in the firelight. I kept the fire small but steady. The smoke hung low and drifted through the trees. I cooked and ate and stayed close to the heat until the dark pressed in. That night, the steps came earlier. They did not circle at first. They approached. I heard the weight settle close to my feet, just outside the tarp. The fabric moved slightly, not from wind but from proximity. Something stood there. I could feel it in the way the air changed. The steps resumed, slower than before. They made a full circuit, and then stopped near my head. The tarp bowed inward as something leaned against it. Not a brush, not a stumble, a steady pressure. The trekking pole flexed under the load. The fabric stretched and creaked. I could see the outline of the pole bend in the firelight. I sat up and braced it with my hand. The pressure held for a long second, and then released. The tarp snapped back into place. I did not shout again. I did not turn on my light. I stayed still and listened. The steps moved away, not retreating, just relocating. They stopped somewhere I could not place. I waited until the fire burned down to embers. The dark closed in. I felt exposed in a way that did not match the situation. I was not being attacked. I was being examined. I packed in the dark with hands that shook despite my effort to control them. I left things behind. The tarp, the sleeping bag, food. None of it mattered. I slung my pack and started walking without the trail. The forest was dense, but I moved fast enough to keep from thinking. Branches tore at my sleeves. Roots caught my boots. I did not stop until I reached the road. The walkout took longer than it should have. I did not look back. When I reached the car, I sat inside with the doors locked and the engine running. My breath came too fast. I stayed there until it slowed. I drove out before dawn. The rain followed me. The forest closed behind the road like it always does. Weeks later, back in the apartment that still felt borrowed, I went through the photos on my camera. I had taken few. Trees, water, the fire. In one image, taken without intention as I adjusted the camera near the end of the second night, there was a shape behind me at the edge of the firelight. It was tall and thin, too tall for me. The limbs blurred by motion and low light. The head rose above where it should have been. The shape stood still while I moved. I studied the image until my eyes hurt. The exposure was long. The fire flared. The camera shook. A person standing in shadow could stretch and smear into something that did not look right. A trick of light and timing. That explanation fits. It has to. I enlarged the image and looked at the ground beneath the shape. The mud there was pressed down. Smooth. Deep. I deleted the photo. I do not go back to the peninsula alone anymore. The rain still falls there the same way. I know that. I also know that some people walk quietly and leave little detail behind, and that the forest holds weight without asking what carries it. July 2006 sits in my memory with a sharp edge because of how ordinary it started. The heat that summer had weight to it, the kind that pressed down through the canopy and made every step feel slower than it should. My younger brother and I had been at camp for a few days, long enough for our bodies to fall into the rhythm of waking early, walking all day, and falling asleep hard. We were comfortable in the woods in the way kids get comfortable when they believe the rules they have learned will always hold. Stay on trails. Watch your footing. Make noise for bears. Everything dangerous has a name and a reason. That afternoon, we misjudged how long the loop would take. Clouds had rolled in without rain, thick and gray, trapping the heat. By the time we turned back, our water was low and our legs felt like rubber. The marked trail curved wide around a ridge. Cutting through the trees would save time. My brother had done it before, he had said, and he was younger but more confident in the woods than I was. He knew the shortcuts. He always seemed to know which rules could bend. We stepped off the trail where the undergrowth thinned, pushing through ferns and laurel. At first, nothing felt wrong. The forest was the same mix of oak and poplar, the same smell of warm leaves and dirt. Sunlight broke through in wide patches. Our boots sank into soft soil that gave back slowly. We moved fast, leaning forward, thinking about camp, about the relief of sitting down and taking our packs off. The change did not happen all at once. It crept in over distance. The insects were the first thing to fade. The buzz that had filled the air dropped away until there was only the sound of our own movement. No cicadas, no flies. Even the birds fell silent. I noticed it without knowing why it mattered. The way you notice a room go quiet after a door closes somewhere far away. The ground changed next. The soil grew tight and dry, covered in a mat of old leaves that did not crunch the way fresh ones do. Each step had a dull, padded sound, like walking on old boards under carpet. There was a faint give underfoot, not enough to sink, but enough to feel wrong. It reminded me of floors in abandoned houses, places where you test your weight before committing. The trees began to look strained. Their trunks leaned at odd angles, all of them bent inward as if pushed from the outside. Many had snapped tops, the breaks jagged and twisted rather than clean. These were not fresh breaks. The wood had darkened at the edges. Moss had begun to creep over some of them. It looked like something tall had moved through without slowing, not caring what stood in its way. I slowed without deciding to. My brother noticed and matched my pace. We did not speak. There was no need. The quiet pressed in, thick enough to feel on my skin. Sweat ran down my spine and soaked into my shirt. The air smelled flat, heavy, lacking the sharp green scent I expected. Breathing felt like drawing air through cloth. The first sound from behind us was soft enough to be mistaken for wind. A long pull of air followed by a slow release. It repeated, steady, close enough that my shoulders tightened before my mind caught up. It was breathing, deep and wet, as if something large was filling its lungs all the way and emptying them without hurry. We stopped at the same time. The breathing stopped with us. The silence after was complete. No leaves moved. No branches creaked. My pulse hammered in my ears, loud enough that I wondered if that was what I was hearing instead. We started walking again. The breathing returned, matching our pace. Each time we slowed, it slowed. Each time we paused, it paused. It never rushed. It never lagged. It stayed just behind, close enough to hear clearly, but far enough to remain unseen. My brother's shoulders hunched. His head turned slightly, nose lifting as if testing the air. His face tightened. He made a small gesture toward his chest, then his throat, then the space behind us, a way of communicating without sound. He was picking up a smell. He later described it as rotten and sweet at the same time, like meat left too long mixed with something sugary. At the time, I smelled nothing at all. The absence of it scared me more than the idea of the smell itself. It meant whatever was there was not reaching me, or I was already too overwhelmed to notice. The path we had aimed for was no longer clear. The trees closed in, their branches interlocking overhead. Light thinned to a dull gray. The ground rose and fell in shallow dips. In some places it sagged, leaves sinking under our boots, and then settling back, leaving no clear prints. I thought of sinkholes, of old mine shafts hidden under rot. I adjusted my steps, placing my weight carefully, trying not to make noise. The breathing continued. It did not sound animal to me. There was no panting, no snorting. It was controlled, patient, as if whoever or whatever it belonged to had all the time it needed. A branch snapped to our left. It did not fall. It cut through the air at an angle and hit the ground ahead of us, bouncing once before rolling to a stop. It was thick, heavier than something that would fall on its own. Another followed, landing closer. Leaves shook where it had been torn free. We ran. The forest blurred. Branches whipped at my arms and face. My pack slammed against my back. The ground that had felt hollow moments before now threatened to give way with every stride. I did not look back. I could hear my brothers breathing beside me, fast and ragged. To our left, more branches broke free, snapping sharp and loud, striking trunks and earth in our path. None came from above. They came from the side, thrown hard enough to travel. Something moved with us. I did not see it, but I felt its presence in the way the sounds stayed level, never gaining, never falling behind. The breathing was gone now, replaced by the noise of movement, heavy steps pushing through brush without slowing. My legs burned. My chest tightened. The air tasted like metal. The light ahead brightened, thinning into long lines. I aimed for it without thinking, trusting that it meant open space. When my foot hit packed dirt instead of leaves, I stumbled forward and caught myself on a wooden post. The trail. The real trail, worn and clear, cut through the trees like a scar. The sounds behind us stopped at the edge of it. No more snapping. No more movement. The forest beyond the trail stood still, as if nothing had passed through it all. We did not stop running until we could see the orange of tents through the trees. Camp smelled like smoke and food and people. The noise hit us all at once, voices and laughter and metal clanging. My hands shook as I dropped my pack. My brother bent forward, hands on his knees, sucking in air. Later, after we had cooled down and the world felt solid again, my brother looked at me with a confusion that did not fade. He told me he had heard me calling his name in the woods, behind him, the same way our parents did when they wanted us to stop. He thought I was falling back or playing around. He had turned his head more than once, expecting to see me. Each time, the calling stopped when he slowed. I had not made a sound. I knew that with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Fear had closed my throat tight. I had been focused on staying upright, on not falling into whatever lay under the leaves. The idea that something else had used my voice, or that his mind had filled in a sound that was not there, sat between us like a weight. The explanation came days later, pieced together from what we learned and what we saw ourselves when we walked the area again with adults. Not to retrace our steps, but to understand. There was an illegal camp less than a mile from where we had cut through. It was tucked into a fold of the land, hidden by the way the ground dipped and rose. The place reeked of rot and sweetness from bait left out too long. There were signs of ginseng digging, holes where roots had been ripped out and the earth left open. Branches had been cleared and stacked, some used as markers, others ready to be thrown to scare off anyone who wandered too close. The trees bent inward because someone had forced a path through over and over, cutting corners, pushing straight through instead of around. The snapped tops were from ropes thrown over branches, pulled down hard to hang tarps and meat. The breathing made sense then too. A man working hard in the heat, lungs wet from years of smoke, pacing us without showing himself, gauging whether we were a threat. The thrown branches were meant to hurt us, to drive us back the way we came without forcing a confrontation. Staying just out of sight kept the advantage. Matching our pace kept us from stopping long enough to look. The voice did not have to be anything more than my brother's mind reaching for something familiar under stress. In a place that quiet, with fear pressing in, the brain fills gaps fast. It borrows what it knows. It uses the safest sound it can find. Knowing all of that did not soften the memory. It sharpened it. It meant the danger had been real, human, and close enough to breathe behind us without rushing. It meant someone had watched us choose the shortcut and decided how to handle it. When I think back on that day, I do not picture monsters or shadows. I picture a man standing just beyond the trees, patient and practiced, waiting for us to do exactly what we did. May of 2020 was quiet in rural Missouri in a way that felt unnatural, even for that part of the state. Lockdowns had thinned out traffic. Farms still ran, but fewer trucks moved back roads. The place we chose sat far from pavement, a creek cut through timber and limestone, reachable only by walking an old logging scar that no longer showed up on maps. The idea came from one of my friends who had grown up nearby. He said his uncle used to fish there when he was younger, before the bridge washed out and the county stopped caring. No road access meant no pressure. That was the reason. That was enough. The three of us parked along a narrow gravel shoulder before sunrise. The air smelled like wet soil and cut hay. Fog clung low in the valleys and stayed there as the sky lightened. We loaded packs with rods, a small cooler, a tent each, and food meant to last one night. The walk-in took just under an hour, downhill through mixed oak and cedar, past fence remnants half swallowed by bark. The woods felt empty, not peaceful, just empty. No squirrels crossed our path. No birds lifted from branches. The sound of our boots carried farther than it should have. The creek revealed itself without noise. No rushing, no chatter over rocks. Just a ribbon of clear water sliding through pale gravel. It was cold enough to sting fingers. You could see straight to the bottom, every stone sharp and clean, no algae slick, no leaf rot. It looked like a creek that had just been poured there. The banks were steep in places, carved down to exposed roots that hung like ribs. The silence pressed in once we reached the water. No frogs clicking from the banks. No insects hovering. No birds calling overhead. Even the breeze seemed to thin out near the creek, like air avoided the channel. We noticed it right away. None of us said anything, but we slowed and started scanning the trees and the water the way people do when something does not fit. I told myself it was still early, that the cool night air kept animals quiet. That explanation felt thin even then. We set up camp on a flat bend above the water, a small gravel bar backed by cottonwoods. The trees were tall and pale, bark peeling in long strips. The ground was hard-packed, dirt mixed with stones. No old fire rings. No trash. No sign anyone had been there in a long time. That should have felt good. It did not. Fishing was the point, so we rigged rods and stepped into the creek. The water numbed my legs almost immediately. It moved slow but steady, deepening without warning in darker channels. Casting felt wrong. The line landed without sound. No ripples spread the way they should. The surface swallowed everything and stayed flat. We worked upstream, spacing ourselves out, eyes on the water. The clarity made it easy to see nothing living below. No minnows darted. No crawfish tucked between stones. The creek looked sterile. About an hour in, I felt it before I heard it. A pressure change in the air, a faint vibration through the soles of my boots. Then came the sound. Splashing upstream, not fast, not panicked. Slow and deliberate, moving against the current. Each step displaced water with weight. The sound carried clean through the channel. It was not the erratic crash of a deer crossing. It was steady measured. Whatever moved did so with intent. A smell followed a few seconds later. Wet copper, metallic and sharp, like blood diluted with water. It drifted down with the current and clung to the back of my throat. I lifted my head and scanned the bend above me. Trees blocked the view. The splashing continued, closer now, still upstream. None of us called out. We stayed still, rods half raised, watching the water. The creek level changed. It was subtle but undeniable. The water rose around my boots, cold line creeping higher against my shins. Gravel shifted underfoot as the flow altered. Something large had entered the channel or moved through a deeper pocket. The displacement sent a slow surge down toward us, smooth and heavy. I stepped back toward the bank without thinking. My friends did the same. The splashing stopped. We stood there listening. The smell thickened for a moment, then faded. No sound followed. No movement in the trees. The creek settled into its previous level as if nothing had happened. We waited longer than made sense, then finished the stretch in silence. No bites. No signs of fish. We headed back downstream, rods trailing, eyes scanning every bend. By the time we reached camp, the day had warmed. Sunlight filtered through leaves and touched the gravel bar. The normal cues of safety should have returned with the light. They did not. The woods remained still. Even flies stayed away from our food as we ate a late lunch. That should have been a relief. It felt wrong instead. We decided to stay the night anyway. The walkout would have been worse after dark, and none of us wanted to admit how unsettled we felt. We pitched tents in a loose line facing the creek. The cooler sat between them, wedged against a log. We checked the area for tracks and found nothing clear. The gravel showed old impressions blurred by time. No fresh prints stood out. The copper smell never returned, but the air stayed heavy. As evening set in, the temperature dropped fast. Shadows stretched long across the gravel bar. The creek reflected the sky without distortion, a mirror laid flat. We cooked simple food and ate quietly. The absence of sound grew louder as the light faded. No night insects started up. No owls called. The dark arrived complete and thick, swallowing detail beyond the fire's edge. I crawled into my tent early. Sleep did not come. The fabric felt thin. Every shift of air brushed it like a hand. I lay there listening to my own breathing, counting seconds between sounds. The creek continued its soft slide unchanged. Time stretched. Sometime deep into the night, the ground vibrated. Not enough to wake me fully at first, just a tremor that pulled me from the edge of sleep. Then came the sound of movement through camp. Footsteps on gravel, heavy and uneven. Each step pressed down hard, then dragged slightly as weight shifted. Joints popped with each motion, wet and dull. The pattern was wrong. Too slow for a person, too upright for anything that moved on four legs with ease. It passed between the tents. I could track it by sound alone. Gravel crunching under weight. The cooler shifted slightly, plastic creaking. The steps stopped outside my tent. The fabric bowed inward as something leaned close. I froze, muscles locked, breath shallow. An exhale came through the nylon, hot and sour. The smell carried rot and iron. Moisture dampened the fabric where the breath touched. It lingered there, pressed close, then withdrew. The steps resumed, moving away toward the trees. Branches snapped under weight. Leaves rustled high up, then settled. The night closed back in around the camp. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten, heart pounding, body aching from stillness. Morning revealed the damage. The cooler sat where we left it, but it no longer held its shape. The lid was not opened. The sides were crushed inward, plastic spiderwebbed with stress fractures. The contents inside were flattened, food mashed into pulp. Claw marks did not rake it open. Teeth did not puncture through. Something had applied pressure from above and the side and kept pushing until the structure failed. Tracks surrounded the cooler, clearer now in the angled light. The impressions showed large pads, splayed, with long claws pressed deep into the gravel. Some prints landed flat. Others showed only the front half of the foot, toes digging in, heel raised. The stride length varied, uneven. In places, the prints aligned in pairs close together, as if the weight had shifted upright for several steps. The explanation formed before I wanted it to. Black bears had returned to Missouri in small numbers. Older males sometimes traveled alone, pushing into new territory. Mange could strip fur and weaken joints. Injury could force an animal to rise to reach food or balance. A wounded bear could move along a creek, using the water to mask scent and sound. Blood from a recent kill would explain the copper smell. Standing to investigate camp would explain the upright steps, the popping joints under stress. Crushing a cooler without opening it fit a bear testing an unfamiliar object with brute force. The creek's silence made sense too. Predators shift ecosystems. Smaller animals retreat or go quiet when a dominant presence moves in. The absence of frogs and insects pointed to sustained pressure, not a passing visit. We packed fast and left without fishing another cast. The walkout felt longer, every sound amplified. We did not see the animal again. We did not need to. The explanation settled into place with each step away from the creek. The place was untouched because nothing else wanted it. I was there because I needed the overtime. Late fall pays better because nobody wants it. The bugs are gone, but the cold comes in early, and the light drops fast. Northern Ontario Crown land looks empty on a map, but it is never empty. It just hides what is there. I worked land survey. That year had been slow. Timber boundaries were still getting cut, and the company needed corners flagged before freeze-up locked the ground too hard to drive stakes. I took the job without asking many questions. I signed out a radio, a GPS unit, flagging tape, a machete, and a pack with food and extra socks. No partner was available. That was normal for short lines. The bush was already frozen at the edges. Muskeg locked just enough to walk on if weight stayed spread out. Each step needed care. Break through and you soaked a boot. The spruce bogs held cold like a freezer. The air smelled like iron and rot. Leaves were gone. Everything was sticks and shadow. I parked at a skid road cut a few years earlier. Ruts were frozen solid. Old logging slash lay gray and brittle along the edges. I noted the time on my GPS and started cutting line north. The machete rang dull against frozen brush. Each swing sent a vibration into my wrist. I worked slow to save energy. The day was quiet in a way that made small sounds feel loud. My breath was steady. The radio stayed clipped to my chest strap, volume high enough to catch traffic if anyone came within range. The first hour passed without trouble. Flagging went up clean. Orange tape against black spruce, spaced by habit. I moved through tamarack and alder, then onto firmer ground. Every so often I checked bearings and distance. The forest closed behind me as I cut. The line became a narrow tunnel through brush, obvious to anyone who followed. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed the tape. It was tied in knots I did not use. Not the quick half hitch or loose wrap that lets tape flap. These were tight, stacked knots, short tails trimmed clean. The tape itself looked fresh, not the faded stuff left by trappers or old crews. The spacing was wrong too. Too deliberate. Too neat. Surveyors do not waste time tying knots like that. We tear and wrap. Speed matters. I stopped and scanned the bush. No sound. No movement. The light was starting to angle low, turning everything blue. I told myself it was another crew marking something else. Crown land holds many users. Logging, trappers, mineral claims. Still, the knots bothered me. They took time. Someone wanted them that way. I cut past the tape and kept moving. 10 minutes later, I noticed boot prints. They were in my cut line. Not beside it. Not crossing. In it. Each print fell where mine had been. Heel to toe, same stride length. Whoever made them had stepped exactly where I stepped, like they were conserving effort or testing something. The snow was thin, just enough to hold an outline. The edges were sharp. Recent. I knelt and looked closer. The tread was not mine. Different pattern. Wider heel. A work boot, not a hiking boot. The prints did not lead off anywhere. They just existed in my line. I stood and looked back. My own tracks came from the skid road. These appeared behind me with no break. I felt a tightness in my chest that I blamed on cold. I told myself it was another surveyor following the same line earlier, maybe stepping in my tracks by chance. That explanation did not hold. The cut brush was fresh. Sap still wet. No one had been here before me that day. I checked my radio. No traffic. I keyed it and released without speaking, just to be sure it worked. The squelch clicked. Nothing else. I kept working because that is what you do when you are paid by the day and daylight is limited. I flagged corners and logged points. The forest seemed to press closer as the sun dropped. Shadows stretched across the muskeg. My breath came out in clouds that hung low. Around 4:10 p.m., I found the bones. They were stacked against the base of a black spruce, just off my line. Not scattered. Not gnawed. Clean. Long bones laid parallel. A skull placed on top, jaw missing. No blood in the snow. No drag marks. The pile looked arranged, not dumped. I had seen wolf kills and bear kills. They are messy. There are chew marks, crushed ends, hair, sign. This was different. The bones were pale and dry, like they had been cleaned somewhere else and brought here. I stood still for a long time. The forest was silent in a way that felt forced. No birds. No wind. I could hear my heart in my ears. I scanned the area for snares or camps. Nothing obvious. No fire pit. No tracks leading away. The ground around the spruce was packed hard, as if someone had stood there for a while. I reached for my radio. My hand hesitated. Calling it in meant paperwork and delay. It also meant admitting something was wrong. I keyed the mic. The radio crackled and played my own voice back to me, delayed by about 2 seconds, saying my call sign. I had not spoken yet. The sound was thin and metallic, like a recording played through cheap speakers. It stopped as suddenly as it started. I froze. My thumb was still on the button. I released it. The radio went quiet. No follow-up. No carrier. Just dead air. There are explanations for radio issues. Feedback. Crosstalk. Repeaters catching a loop. None of them fit what I heard. I had not said my call sign. I had not said anything at all. The delay was precise. 2 seconds, not random. The voice sounded like mine but flat, stripped of breath. I packed up without finishing the line. I did not run. Running in muskeg gets you hurt. I moved steady and fast, backtracking along my cut. The boot prints were there again, now clear in the low light. They followed me. Not beside. In my steps. Every place I had stepped, someone else had stepped too. The spacing matched mine exactly. It felt like being watched by the ground itself. The light dropped fast. The temperature fell with it. My breath came harder. I focused on keeping my pace even. I told myself to think like a professional. Assess. Act. The bones could be from a poacher cleaning a deer. The knots could be from someone with time. The radio could be interference. Each explanation stacked, but together they leaned the wrong way. I checked behind me often. The bush stayed still. No sound of footsteps. No cracking branches. Just the soft crunch of my own boots and the whisper of tape fluttering as I passed. When I reached the skid road, the track stopped. Perfectly. My prints went on toward the truck. The other prints ended at the edge of the road, as if whoever made them had vanished or turned around without leaving a mark. The road itself showed no new tracks. The frozen ruts were smooth, dusted with old snow. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the tree line. The radio stayed quiet. The sky had gone deep blue. I got into the truck and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. The heater took time to blow warm air. I drove out slow, watching the mirrors. That night, I slept poorly. I replayed the day in my head, looking for mistakes. I wrote my report carefully, sticking to facts. I noted the bones. I noted the radio issue as interference. I did not mention the knots or the tracks. Those felt like things that would get shrugged off. A week later, I was called into the office. Not for discipline, for context. Another crew had been pulled from a block 20 kilometers east after finding similar bone piles. The ministry had been notified. Conservation officers were involved. It was not wolves. It was not bears. The explanation came pieced together over time, through reports and quiet conversations. A man had been living out there on Crown land, moving camps often. He had worked logging years earlier and knew survey practices well enough to mimic them. He hunted out of season and processed deer carefully, removing meat and cleaning bones for transport. He stacked the remains as markers, not trophies. Markers for himself, to map where he had been and where he planned to return. The knots were his. He tied them as a signature, a way to tell his own tape from others at a glance. He followed cut lines because they were easy paths through thick bush. Stepping in existing tracks conserved energy and avoided breaking crust that would leave noise and sign. He stayed close enough to watch, but far enough to remain unseen. The radio issue had an explanation too. He carried a cheap scanner and a handheld transmitter, the kind sold at flea markets. He recorded my call sign earlier in the day when I did a check-in, then replayed it on the same frequency when he saw me key up, triggering a delayed playback. It was a way to see reactions. A test. When officers finally located him, it was by accident. A fire spotted from the air. He did not resist. He had been cold, hungry, and careful. He admitted to watching surveyors and loggers, learning their habits. He said the bush felt safer when he knew who was moving through it. I did not go back to that block. The company reassigned me without argument. The overtime paid my bills, but it cost me something else. I still work survey. I still take late fall jobs. I do not work alone anymore. When I cut line, I look at the ground as much as the trees. I pay attention to tape. I listen to my radio, and when it speaks, I make sure it is me. February of 2015 is frozen in my memory in a way that has nothing to do with cold. I have worked search and rescue for years. I know how winter behaves. I know what it does to bodies, to judgment, to terrain. I know how people disappear without drama and how death can look clean when snow hides the worst of it. What happened during that search sits outside the normal boundaries of experience. Not because it was impossible, but because every detail lined up too neatly until it became wrong. The mountain forest had no official name on our paperwork. It was part of a long spine of land that rose and fell across county lines, a mix of public land and old logging tracts reclaimed by time. Thick conifers packed close together. Narrow drainages that cut deep and stayed dark even at midday. Snow that crusted on top and gave way without warning. The kind of place where sound does not travel well and orientation slips easily if you stop paying attention. The missing hiker had been overdue by 3 days. Solo, late 20s, experienced enough to attempt a winter route, but not known to us personally. His planned loop was logged with a friend, not with rangers, which meant we started behind the clock. Weather records showed 2 clear days followed by a sharp temperature drop and wind. That combination closes windows fast. We staged out of a gravel turnout on an old service road. Trucks idled low. Breath steamed and hung heavy before being pulled apart by the wind. Radios were checked and checked again. Batteries swapped even if they read full. In winter, equipment failures are quiet and unforgiving. I was on a 4-person ground team assigned to a mid-elevation grid. The terrain rose steadily, broken by shelves of rock and clusters of fir that grew tight and tall. Snow depth varied from ankle to thigh depending on exposure. We moved slow, deliberate, scanning for anything out of place. A broken branch, a footprint half filled with drift, a flash of color where nothing else held it. Late morning, one of us spotted the pack. It sat upright at the base of a pine, leaned carefully against the trunk as if set there with intention. No straps tangled, no snow packed into seams. The fabric was dry. The buckles were clipped. It did not look abandoned. It looked stored. We spread out and documented before touching anything. Photographs from every angle. Coordinates logged. Snow depth measured. Wind direction noted. Standard procedure, but the feeling in my chest tightened as soon as I saw it. People do not remove packs unless something has gone very wrong or very right. This was neither. Inside, the contents were orderly. Food intact. Stove unused. Extra gloves folded. Headlamp present. Batteries full. No damage. No blood. No sign of animal interference. The top pocket held a laminated map with handwritten notes along the margins. Routes marked. Elevation points circled. Bearings penciled in a tight, practiced hand. There were no tracks leading away. Snow around the tree was undisturbed except for our own boots. No drag marks. No scuffing. Nothing that suggested a fall or struggle. We expanded the search radius immediately, moving outward in slow arcs, probing with poles where the crust softened. Nothing surfaced. No scent. No cloth. No break in the white. The weather held through the afternoon. Light stayed flat and gray. The forest swallowed depth perception. We called it when daylight began to bleed away. Night operations in that terrain would have risked more lives than they could save. We established a temporary camp lower down, in a stand of trees that cut the wind. Tents went up with practiced efficiency. Snow walls built. A perimeter set. Radios stayed on. Fatigue settled into bones as it always does after cold work. Muscles ache in a dull, steady way. Hands throb when they warm. The forest quieted as night deepened. Wind moved high above us, not at ground level, a low sound that felt like pressure more than noise. The radio crackled once, sharp and sudden. We all froze. Static is common. Cold plays tricks with electronics. This was different. The burst had structure. Cadence. Then a voice came through. It was calm. Even. Measured. It read off coordinates. They were not random. They matched the hiker's map. A specific junction between drainages. A point that only someone who had studied that route would know mattered. Not a trailhead. Not a landmark obvious from a map alone. The transmission ended cleanly. No call sign. No identifier. Just the numbers. We checked our own radios. All accounted for. All transmitting on the same channel. No one had keyed a mic. No one had spoken. The coordinates were uphill. Past where we had already searched. Past where we would have gone in the morning. We logged the transmission. Batteries were checked again. Antennas reseated. We scanned for interference sources. There were no repeaters in that area. No towers. No private frequencies that overlapped ours. Another transmission came 15 minutes later. Same voice. Same tone. Different coordinates. Closer. Still only numbers. We did not respond. Protocol dictates radio silence in unknown transmission events unless directed otherwise. Still, every person there leaned closer to the sound, as if proximity might explain it. The cold deepened overnight. Temperature dropped well below forecast. Condensation froze along tent seams. Sleep came in thin stretches. Each time I drifted, the memory of the voice pulled me back awake. At some point before dawn, one final transmission cut through the static. Coordinates again. These placed the source near the pack. Near us. There was no panic. No rush. Just a heavy understanding that something was deeply off. When first light filtered through the trees, we broke camp fast and tight. No one argued. No one suggested pushing further. Risk assessment had shifted in a way that could not be justified on paper, but made complete sense in the body. We pulled out as the sky lightened. Radios stayed on until the trucks were in sight. The follow-up investigation took weeks. More teams were deployed. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew grid patterns when weather allowed. Nothing new turned up. No body. No clothing. No remains. The radio transmissions were analyzed. Audio engineers cleaned the signal. It was not a loop. not a recording from his phone, not interference from another agency. The voice matched the missing hiker's voicemail greeting, pulled from his phone records. The cadence was the same, the breath pattern between numbers identical. The explanation written into the final report cited hypothermia, disorientation, paradoxical behavior. It suggested he removed his pack to lighten himself, that he wandered into a drainage and succumbed to exposure, that the radio transmissions were likely atmospheric interference carrying fragments of prior broadcasts. Those explanations satisfied the checklist. They closed the case. They did not match the evidence. Hypothermia does not teach a man to transmit precise coordinates without error. It does not preserve a pack against a tree with care. It does not erase tracks cleanly while leaving no sign of struggle. Atmospheric interference does not replicate a specific voice pattern with that level of fidelity. It does not choose meaningful data points. The truth, as we pieced it together quietly among ourselves, was less dramatic and more unsettling. The hiker had carried a secondary radio. It was not logged because it was a personal device, modified for backcountry use. We found purchase records later. It was capable of rebroadcasting on our frequency range if manually adjusted. He had also cached coordinates digitally in the device, likely as a safety measure. He had been alive when he placed the pack. That much was clear. Something had happened after that. An injury. A fall into a drainage where snow bridged over running water. A situation where movement became impossible. In that state, he would have known rescue teams would search downhill first. He would have known that radio transmissions travel differently at night when cold air settles. He used what strength he had to rebroadcast stored data, not to speak freely, but to conserve energy. He did not call for help because he knew the radio would carry better if it transmitted short bursts. Coordinates only. No wasted breath. As his condition worsened, the transmissions drifted closer to the last known point because he could no longer move. The final broadcast placed him near us because that was where his signal could reach before his hands failed. We missed him by hours. By the time the cold settled enough to carry his voice cleanly, he was already beyond movement. By the time we pulled out, his body temperature had dropped past recovery. Snow and wind erased him in a way that left no trace. No one ever said this out loud in an official setting. It lives in the spaces between reports and in the way none of us ever dismiss a radio transmission again, no matter how strange it sounds. The forest did not take him in a dramatic way. It did not need to. It simply waited, quiet and patient, while a man did everything right and still disappeared. I still hear the cadence of those numbers when radios crackle at night, not as a haunting, as a reminder that the line between order and loss is thin, and that sometimes the most frightening thing is realizing how close help can be without ever arriving. June 2009 sits in my memory with a weight that never lifted. The interior of Newfoundland was green then in a way that felt crowded, the kind of growth that pushes back when you move through it. 4 of us went in together because that was normal for us. We had done it before. We knew the cut lines, the old logging roads grown thin, the bog edges that could swallow a boot if you trusted them. We were not reckless. We carried maps printed years earlier and a handheld GPS that ate batteries fast. We parked the truck where the road broke into grass and alder and walked from there, packs light, boots wet before the first kilometer was done. The air smelled like wet leaves and iron-rich water. Black flies worked our necks. The ground flexed in places, a slow bounce that made your calves tense. Moose sign was everywhere. Fresh droppings that still shone. Hair on bark. The wide split of tracks crossing the road, sunk deep from weight. Moose are loud animals when they want to be. They snap branches, grunt, breathe like bellows. We knew that sound. We had heard it since we were kids, crossing roads at dusk, standing stupidly close with cameras, laughing later when our hands shook. We followed a line that cut between low spruce and birch. The ground rose just enough to drain, then dipped again into a sponge of moss and water. The day stayed gray. Light filtered down but never landed. Every sound stayed close. The wind never picked up. It felt like being inside a lung. We stopped to drink and checked the GPS. That was when we heard it. Not a crack or a single crash, but motion. Continuous movement through brush without pause. It came from our left, downslope fast. The sound was heavy, a rush that pressed air aside. Branches snapped in sequence. Trees shook, not one or two, but a line of them, as if something long and tall was passing through and not caring about what stood in the way. Moose are loud. This was louder. Moose slow when the ground turns bad. This did not. The noise did not stumble. It did not bog down. It ran through alder like water pushed by a flood. We froze because that is what you do when something big moves near you and you do not know its line. The sound cut across our direction, then curved, then came straight at us. I could feel it in my chest. The breathing came with it, harsh and fast, too fast for the size of the sound. Moose breathed heavy but spaced. This was rapid, a pumping hiss that rose and fell with the stride. It was upright in the way it moved, not because I saw a body, but because the tops of the shrubs bent and snapped before the bases did, because shadows passed at a height that did not match a back low to the ground. We saw antler-shaped shadows flicker through the leaves, wide and uneven, as if thrown by hands. The light was wrong for clean shapes. Everything blurred. Still, those shapes stood out, moving above the brush line. The noise hit the trees around us and kept going, close enough that bark dust fell, close enough that the ground shuddered underfoot. I remember the smell more than anything. A sharp animal heat, like wet fur and sour breath, carried by motion. It passed across us and then beyond, crashing downslope, then cutting right again, circling fast. We did not run. Running in bog and brush is how you break an ankle and die slow. We stood and tracked the sound with our bodies, turning as one without thinking. When it crossed our path the second time, farther out, it broke a young spruce clean at the base. The trunk snapped with a sound like a bat on a ball. The top fell and dragged brush with it. Whatever it was did not slow. It kept breathing hard, the pace unchanged. It vanished into thicker growth, the noise thinning, then swelling again as it found another line. Minutes passed without speech. We waited because waiting is what keeps you alive when you do not know. The forest settled. Leaves stopped shaking. The breathing faded until it was only our own, loud in our ears. Flies came back. We did not leave right away. We checked wind and direction and moved as a group toward where it had crossed, slow, careful, scanning. The ground there told a story that made no sense at first glance. Tracks cut through mud and moss, deep and torn. Some were clear cloven impressions, wide and heavy, the shape you expect from a big bull. Others blurred into long ovals, smeared, as if the weight had rolled onto a different part of the foot. In a few places, the prints looked almost flat, the front pressed deep, the back shallow, like a foot that had changed angle mid-stride. It was not a straight line. It wove, then straightened, then curved again. We followed the tracks for a short distance because curiosity pulls harder than fear once the noise stops. Branches were broken high, higher than a moose shoulder, snapped or bent and left hanging. Bark was scraped off in long vertical streaks. In one patch of mud, the prints overlapped, one shape inside another, as if the animal had shifted weight from toe to heel without slowing. The spacing stayed even. There was no stumble, no slide. We stopped following when the ground dropped into a bog that shimmered black and green. The tracks went straight through it. Water splashed up and left a churned line. We did not go after. We marked the spot on the GPS and turned back the way we came, moving faster now but not running. The rest of the walk passed without incident. We reached the truck in the same gray light. No one spoke. We drove out on the road grown thin, tires hissing through wet grass, the engine loud in the quiet. Nobody talked on the drive home. That silence stretched, heavy, as the kilometers passed and the forest opened into scattered houses and gravel yards. Later that night, alone, I tried to make sense of it. Sleep did not come easy. The breathing replayed. The speed. The way the trees shook. I went back through what I knew. Moose can rear. Bulls can charge. Adrenaline can make time bend. Sound can lie in thick woods. Tracks can blur in boggy ground. Melt at the edges. Overlap when an animal turns sharp. Antlers throw strange shadows. Fear fills gaps. Days later, we returned with fresh eyes and a plan to look without panic. The weather had changed. Sun cut through the canopy in clean lines. The bog surface had skinned over slightly, making prints clearer at the edges and softer in the middle. We found the same break in the spruce. The bark scrapes lined up with antler height. In the mud, the changing shape made more sense. Where the animal had run at full speed, the hoof tips cut deep. Then the heel came down hard as it shifted weight to turn, flattening the print. In places, the hind foot landed inside the front print, making a longer shape. The spacing measured out to a long stride consistent with a large bull at a run. The breathing still bothered me. Moose breathe hard, but that fast pace seemed wrong. Then I noticed the slope. The animal had been running uphill part of the time, pushing through thick brush. In cool air, breath carries. In still woods, it echoes off trunks and comes back layered, faster than it should be. When we stood where we had been and clapped, the sound bounced in odd ways, coming back sharp and quick, almost like panting. We followed the line again, farther this time, skirting the bog edge where the ground held. We found a bed site not far on, trampled moss and hair, the smell strong. The hair caught on branches was dark and coarse. Moose hair. Nearby, a patch of young spruce had been rubbed raw, sap oozing. Antler polish. There were no other tracks mixed in. No bear sign. No human sign. The explanation settled slow, like silt. A large bull, likely in poor condition after winter, moving fast for reasons we could only guess. Maybe surprised. Maybe chased by flies. Maybe crossing territory. When it reared to push through brush or pivoted hard, it would look upright, throw shadows high, change the pressure of its feet. In bog and mud, tracks lie. They stretch and smear and overlap, especially at speed. Our fear had filled in edges, sharpened sound, stretched time. What stayed with me was not the answer, but the lesson. In that interior, scale lies to you. Distance compresses. Sound stacks. Animals move with a purpose that does not include you until it does. Moose are loud. Sometimes they are louder than you expect. Upright is a trick of brush and light and panic. We had been close to a very large, very fast animal that did not slow because it did not need to. We had been in its line for seconds that felt like minutes. We left unhurt because it never turned its focus on us. I still walk those woods. I still listen. When branches start to snap in sequence and the ground hums, I step aside and let whatever owns that moment pass. The interior keeps its rules. We learned one of them that day and carried it home in silence. July of 2003 sits in my head like a held breath. The summer air in the Southern California mountains carried pine sap, dust, and the dry sweetness of chaparral. I was on staff at a small mountain camp that sat in a bowl of trees between two ridgelines. The place had been there since the 50s, built cheap and repaired often. The cabins were long, low rectangles of aging wood, spaced just far enough apart that at night each one felt alone. Gravel paths connected them like pale scars through the dirt. Beyond the last cabin, the forest dropped away fast into steep ground thick with scrub oak and manzanita. I was in my early 20s and thought I understood the outdoors. I had grown up hiking, sleeping outside, learning animal tracks. I trusted explanations that made sense. I trusted routine. That summer had followed a clean pattern until the last week of July. The kids were the first to notice anything. Complaints filtered up during the day, passed along by counselors who did not take them seriously. Something had been walking outside at night. Something had circled the cabins. Something had stopped near the doors. We blamed deer because deer were everywhere. They moved quietly, brushed against walls, and liked to linger. They could sound heavy when close. That answer settled everyone for a while. At night, I slept in a staff cabin near the center of camp. The building had thin walls, narrow windows, and a front door that swelled shut in summer. The doorframe carried scars from decades of use. The latch sat loose. When the wind moved through the trees, the door rattled. I had learned the difference between wind, animals, and people, or at least I thought I had. The first night I noticed anything myself, it was after midnight. The camp was quiet in a way that only happened deep in the week, once exhaustion settled in. Insects buzzed low. A distant owl moved through the dark. I lay awake on my bunk, listening without trying to. Footsteps reached me through the floor and walls. Not running, not stumbling. A slow, measured pace on gravel. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other. It stopped near the front door. I waited for the scrape of a hoof or the bump of a nose against wood. Nothing came. The steps resumed, circling the building. Each footfall landed with weight and intention. The pattern felt wrong for deer. They tended to startle and scatter. This sound stayed close. I told myself it was a counselor on rounds. That explanation fit the rules of the place. Staff checked cabins at night, moving quietly so as not to wake kids. Still, something about the rhythm felt off. The steps were too slow, too deliberate. They paused at the door again. I lay still, counting my breath, waiting for a knock that did not come. By morning, the feeling had faded enough that I did not mention it. Daylight flattened fear. The sun burned through the trees, and the camp filled with noise. Kids ran between cabins. Staff joked, worked, planned. The director reminded us that mountain lions moved through the area. We were told to stay alert but calm. A lion explanation carried authority. It fit the mountains. It kept the problem outside of us. The second night was worse. The air stayed warm after sunset, holding sound close to the ground. I woke to footsteps again, closer this time, sharper on gravel. They moved in a slow circle, stopping at each door of the staff cabins in turn. I could track the path by ear. When the steps reached my cabin, they stopped. The silence pressed in. I listened for breathing and heard none. The steps resumed and moved on. The next morning, I walked the gravel paths and studied the ground. The soil was dry and packed, hard to mark. Near the edges, where pine needles gathered, I found impressions. They were not hooves. They were not paws. They were partial prints of boots, worn smooth at the heel, the tread shallow. Someone had walked there with care, placing each foot to avoid noise. I brought this to the director. The answer came back firm and controlled. Mountain lions could leave odd marks. People were not supposed to be in the area. The camp sat on private land. The gates were locked at night. The explanation ended there. The third night, the sound changed. It started earlier, before midnight, while some staff still moved between buildings. The footsteps joined the background at first, easy to dismiss. Then they settled into a pattern that made my stomach tighten. The steps moved cabin to cabin, stopping at each door long enough to test the handle. The test was gentle, careful. Wood shifted. Metal clicked softly. The sound reached my door and stopped. A knock came then. Not loud, not urgent. A single firm tap, placed at the height of a hand. It landed with intent. Mountain lions did not knock. The thought arrived clear and cold. I stayed still. The door did not open. After a pause that felt long enough to measure my fear, the steps moved on. Sleep did not return. I lay there until dawn, listening to every sound the forest made, separating insects from wind from distant movement. When light reached the windows, I got up and checked the door. The latch held. The wood around the frame showed a fresh mark, a shallow dent where knuckles had touched. By now, the kids were afraid. They slept poorly. They asked to be moved. Staff brushed off the fear during the day and locked themselves into it at night. The director increased patrols, walking the paths after dark with a radio and a flashlight. The explanation remained the same. Mountain lion. On the fourth night, the pacing returned, heavier than before. The steps did not bother to stay on gravel. They moved through dirt and leaves, closer to the walls. I heard fabric brushwood. I heard a breath this time, controlled, steady, close enough that it carried through the thin wall. The steps stopped at my door. The handle moved, slow and testing. The latch held. Another knock came, 2 taps this time, placed with care. I felt the urge to move, to make noise, to show that someone was inside. I did not. I stayed still because stillness felt safer than any action. The steps lingered, then moved on toward the next cabin. I waited until morning again. At first light, the director called a meeting. We walked the grounds together, studying tracks where we could find them. In the softer dirt beyond the last cabin, the prints were clear. Boots. Adult size. Worn tread. Someone had walked the perimeter, stopping at each building. The director stared at the ground longer than before. The lion explanation weakened, but did not break. The decision was made to involve local authorities quietly. The camp did not want panic. The camp did not want bad attention. A deputy arrived that afternoon, walked the grounds, and followed the tracks until they faded into rocky ground. He said there were transients in the area, people who moved through mountain land, avoiding towns. He said they watched places like camps for food and opportunity. He said the knocking suggested testing, not attack. That night, staff stayed awake in shifts. Lights remained off to avoid drawing attention. The forest felt closer, darker, louder. Near midnight, the steps returned. They moved slower now, as if aware of eyes. They stopped at the first cabin and tested the door. Then the next. When they reached the staff cabin where I sat awake, the steps paused. The knock came again, 3 taps this time, spaced evenly. I watched the door without blinking. The handle did not move. After a long pause, the steps retreated, moving back the way they had come. The deputy returned before dawn. He followed fresh tracks beyond the last cabin and into the drop-off where the ground grew steep and tangled. In a shallow ravine, he found a makeshift camp. A tarp strung low, empty cans, a backpack, boots that matched the prints. The person was gone, likely spooked by increased patrols. The deputy said the knocking made sense now. The person had been checking for empty cabins, moving careful and quiet, avoiding confrontation. The camp changed after that. Patrols stayed in place. Lights went on at night. The gates were checked twice. The kids slept better once we explained that someone had been found and removed. We finished the summer without another incident. I stayed until the end of the season. The forest returned to its usual sounds. Deer moved through again, careless and soft. No more footsteps circled the cabins. No more knocks came at the doors. The explanation held, solid and complete. Years later, the memory still wakes me sometimes. Not fear, but clarity. The sound of deliberate steps. The pause at the door. The understanding that danger does not always announce itself with noise or speed. Sometimes it tests quietly, knocking once, then again, waiting for an answer. April 2022 sat in that gray stretch between winter and spring where the woods of central Pennsylvania never felt settled. The leaves were gone, but the ground was soft, thawed just enough to hold shape. I had planned a simple solo hike on state game lands I knew well, a few hours to clear my head. I parked along a gravel pull-off beside a locked service gate, shouldered my pack, and stepped into trees that were still bare enough to see far between trunks. The air smelled like wet bark and iron-rich soil. Everything looked familiar at first, but the silence felt heavier than usual, like sound was being held back. I followed the marked trail uphill for the first mile, moving at a steady pace. The blazes were old but clear, spaced right, placed with intention. I kept track of landmarks without thinking about it, the way I always did when alone. A bent hemlock, a rock split clean in two, a shallow creek crossing where the mud swallowed boots if you missed the stones. I was relaxed enough to enjoy the steady rhythm of walking, the scrape of gravel under tread, the small ache in my calves. I checked my watch once, then stopped. The time mattered less than the feel of the place. The trail narrowed after a switchback and then leveled out along a ridge. I noticed the change because the ground ahead looked wrong. The leaves were disturbed in a way that didn't match the rest of the path. Not trampled flat like a main trail, not scattered by animals, but pressed down in a thin line that cut across at an angle. Freshly worn. No blazes. No signpost. It looked like a footpath made by someone who didn't want it to be obvious, but also didn't care enough to hide it fully. The soil there was darker, damp, and the footprints were recent enough that the edges hadn't softened yet. I stopped at the intersection and looked around. The ridge dropped away on the far side, trees thinning as the slope fell. Cold air drifted up from below, a slow breath that carried the smell of rot and water. It felt out of place compared to the mild air on the ridge. I told myself it was just a drainage or a hollow holding on to winter. Still, I stood longer than needed, weighing the choice. The map on my phone showed nothing there, but maps miss things all the time. Old logging routes, hunters' shortcuts, forgotten access paths to gas lines. Curiosity pulled harder than caution, and I stepped onto the unmarked trail. It descended at a shallow angle at first, then steepened. The ground was slick with leaf mush and clay. I leaned back to keep balance, boots cutting shallow grooves. The trees grew closer together as I dropped, branches knitting overhead. Light thinned. The air cooled enough that my breath showed in short bursts. I felt it in my lungs and across the back of my neck. The path stayed narrow and consistent, worn by repeated use, not random wandering. That detail should have sent me back sooner. Instead, I focused on my footing and the quiet. The sense of being watched didn't hit all at once. It crept in the way a smell does when you can't place it. A pressure between the shoulder blades. The faint idea that something above the slope had line of sight on me. I glanced uphill without stopping, then kept moving. The woods looked empty, trunks rising straight, no motion. I told myself the feeling came from being off-route and alone. I'd felt it before, and it always passed. The trail bent around a cluster of rocks and dropped again. The soil grew wetter. Water seeped across the path in thin sheets, making it shine. My steps sounded louder here, the slap of rubber on mud echoing faintly. I slowed and listened. Nothing else moved. No birds. No wind. The quiet pressed close, thick enough to feel in my ears. I noticed then how the trail never crossed itself, never branched, never widened. It had purpose. It wasn't old enough to have leaf litter build up, but it wasn't freshly cut either. Someone had been using it regularly. The idea of that someone being nearby slid into my thoughts and stayed there. The slope leveled into a small bench cut into the hillside. The trees opened just enough to show a shallow depression filled with water and dead leaves. A seasonal pool. The ground around it was churned with tracks, mostly deer, some human. Boot prints. Different sizes. Recent. The prints circled the pool and then continued downslope. I stopped at the edge and listened again, longer this time. My pulse sounded too loud in my head. I realized I'd gone farther than planned without checking time or location. That realization brought a clear line of thought. I turned around. The cold air felt sharper as I started back uphill. The climb demanded attention. My breathing deepened. I focused on the pattern of steps and the pull in my thighs. Halfway up the first rise, I heard it. Footsteps behind me. Not close enough to feel breath, not far enough to dismiss. The sound matched mine exactly. Same pace, same weight. When I slowed, it slowed. When I took a longer step, it did too. The timing was perfect, down to the fraction of a second when the sole met mud. I stopped. The sound stopped. The silence that followed felt stretched, thin enough to tear. I didn't turn around at first. I stood there with my weight forward, muscles tight, listening for anything that would give shape to what I'd heard. Nothing came. I turned slowly. The trail behind me was empty. The slope rose and curved out of sight. The disturbed leaves showed only my own prints, sharp and clean. No other marks overlapped them. No scuffed edges. No broken twigs. The woods held still. I waited, counting breaths, until my hands stopped shaking. I told myself the sound had been my own steps echoing off the rock face, delayed by the hollow. It was a weak explanation, but it was the only one that fit without adding something worse. I started walking again, slower now. I listened to each step land, felt the timing. The matching sound returned within seconds. Perfect again. No lag. No deviation. It felt close enough that the back of my neck prickled. I stopped a second time. The sound stopped with me. I turned faster this time, scanning uphill and into the trees. Nothing moved. The sense of eyes on me pressed harder. I didn't run. Running on that slope would have been a mistake. I kept a steady pace, heart hammering, breath controlled by effort and fear. The matching steps stayed with me all the way up, never gaining, never falling back. When the ground leveled near the ridge, the sound faded as if someone had stepped off the trail. I didn't look for where it went. I stepped onto the marked path and didn't slow until the trees thinned near the parking area. The relief of seeing my car came sharp and sudden. The gravel crunch under my boots sounded too loud, too final. I unlocked the door and dropped my pack on the passenger seat. That was when I saw the mud. Thick smears across the roof, dried at the edges, pressed in hand-shaped patches near the rear. It wasn't splash. It wasn't thrown. It looked like someone had climbed up, braced themselves, and stood there. There were streaks where boots had dragged, where weight had shifted. I stood there longer than I should have, staring up at it, letting the pieces settle into place. The unmarked trail, the fresh wear, the cold air pooling below, the sense of being watched from above, the footsteps that matched because someone had paced me, close enough to mirror every move, careful enough to leave no trace in soft ground. The mud on the roof where someone had waited, elevated, with a clear view of the path and the lot. A place to watch arrivals and departures without being seen. I checked the area around the car. No one else was there. No fresh tire tracks besides mine. No footprints near the doors. Whoever it was had been careful. I wiped my hands on my pants, got in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror until the trees swallowed the pull-off. I didn't stop again until I reached pavement. Later, at home, I cleaned the mud off the roof and checked my boots. The tread pattern matched the smears. The handprints were a different size. Larger, wider palms. That detail stayed with me. I reported the unmarked trail to the Game Commission and avoided that area after. Over time, the fear settled into a dull awareness. The woods hadn't changed. I had. I learned how easy it was for a place to hold more people than you could see, how simple it was for someone to share your path without leaving proof, and how thin the line was between a quiet hike and something else entirely.